Welcome to Lecture 20, Experts and Consensus. How do you apply these critical thinking skills to life? Critical thinking is a rational filter to test reality. It's important to apply critical thinking skills to yourself as well as to others. One of the things we need to look at when we're applying our critical thinking skills, we're looking at, is somebody licensed? It's not necessarily, you should not necessarily trust any one person on a topic, and some people actually do possess expertise. True authority rests with the consensus of opinion of experts within a field, not just on one individual. We defer to experts all the time, and it's reasonable to defer to experts in their field. If I go into the physician or a dentist, I expect that physician and dentist to be an expert in their field, and I defer to their judgment. When I take my car into the auto mechanic, I defer to their judgment. They're the expert in the field, and I'm not. So it's reasonable to do this. But it's important to have a basic understanding of a variety of fields to be able to judge the level of expertise. Licensure is typically an internal statement. That is, an individual belongs to a group. Having a license may be a sign of somebody being an expert, but it does not make the person expert. Licensings are for state regulation and for fee collection. We want to be sure that this expert can actually document their training. Not that they've just done some independent reading or independent study, not that they think that they're an expert, but that they can actually document their training. And are their views representative of the profession, or do they hold views that are outside of the profession? Does the majority of whatever profession they're in accept their views, or are they outside of it? And we will always need to ask when we're looking at the information, quite simply, is, does this information make sense? Is this the way the world works? Does it seem confusing? Is it too complicated? Can I even understand it? But really, does it make sense? Is this the way the world is supposed to work? When you get that email from Nigeria saying you send them $200, they're going to send you $87,000, is that really the way the world works? We need to constantly be asking this, does this information make sense? And not only do we look at, is that expert seen as an expert within their field? Do their views represent what's going on in their field? But we also have to check out, is there external confirmation? Do people outside of the field actually agree with this information? Or does it conflict with something we already believe or something we already know? In this case, we're looking at, does the information or the entire field fit in with other fields? Is this information compatible with other fields of knowledge? Has that body of knowledge actually been tested against reality? And this is where we start looking at pseudosciences, homeopathy, acupuncture, acupressure. Is this body of information, is it consistent with other information we know? Is reflexology, is that compatible with what you already know about anatomy and physiology? So we have to look at all of this. And we also need to check when we're looking at the body of information, the field itself, is there a process of self-correction? Does that group of professionals, do they censor people who are on the fringe? Is there internal disciplinary actions? We're looking at this part of it. Is that field transparent? So we're looking at it, can all of the studies be done in this field be reproduced? Or do they publish their studies? Or they try and hide their information, that this is secret information? Do their theories grow over time as new information is brought to light? This is more difficult when the entire profession is suspect. For example, psychics and astrologers, they have their own organizations, their own journals, and their own licensure. So a lot of groups out there put on the facade of actually being very, very legitimate, being scientific groups, being part of the cultural knowledge foundation, when they're really out there on the fringe. But they start forming their own groups, they create their own journals, they even have their own licenses, and it appears as if they're legitimate. And all it is this illusion that their information is compatible with other information. Licensure is used for controlling a profession, for collecting fees, but it's also used to establish legitimacy. If I am a licensed astrologer, then that makes me legitimate. If I'm a licensed astrologer, then astrology must be legitimate because there's a license involved in this. Not necessarily so. We also need to look to see, is there a body of knowledge? Can you learn this? Can you go to books? Can you learn this? Is it transparent? Is this stuff published? And has this body of knowledge actually been tested according to reality? Has somebody actually looked at this and done experiments, either observational experiments or experimental experiments, to really figure out what's the relationship between this information and the real world? We look at the internal confirmation. The internal confirmation, does everybody agree with this? Is there massive disputes within the field about this information? And always with the licensure, remember, licensure is internal. It's about the internal legitimacy of an individual, the internal legitimacy, internal within a field. Even though astrologers can be licensed within their field, that doesn't necessarily make astrology a legitimate science. And when somebody is an expert in one thing, that does not make them an expert in all things. So you might go to somebody, your doctor's not an expert on your auto mechanics, and your auto mechanic is not an expert on teaching you the right golf swing, and that golf pro is not an expert on education. So just because somebody's an expert in one field, they're not necessarily an expert in another field. And sometimes this is a little tricky, because somebody may be an expert in part of a field, but not an expert in another part of a field. And you see this in medicine all the time with all the different specialties, that there might be a physician that's an expert in oncology, but not an expert in your circulatory system, your heart. They're not a heart expert. There's somebody else who's an expert surgeon, but they're really not an expert pediatrician. So being an expert in one area, it does not make somebody an expert in all areas. In our final lecture, we're going to talk about language and thought.